screenings that reflect the rich heritage and diversity of Jewish culture, and to ensure the future of Yiddish through language education. Please go to our website, chicagoyivo.org, for more information and to become a member or a donor. Your financial support helps us bring you programming such as today. Today, for our program, we have Anette Isaacs. German-born and raised, Anette is a historian and public educator who has been presenting hundreds of programs on more than 40 different topics, all pertaining to her native country's history, politics, and culture all over the United States. Ms. Isaacs studied at Emory University, the University of Vienna, and the Freie Universität in Berlin, and holds master's degrees in American Studies, Political Science, and History. She currently serves as the Arts and Culture Director at the Mandel JCC of Palm Beaches, one of the most significant Jewish community centers in America. She is also the Artistic Director of the Palm Beach Jewish Film Festival, which traditionally takes place each January in, as she puts it, sunny Florida. Please help me welcome Anette Isaacs.
Thank you so much, Fran. Thank you so much, everybody. It's so wonderful to be back. And yes, through the wonders of Zoom, how amazing that I get to speak to you from Florida, where it's very windy today. But yes, so I'm excited that you're all here because we have a really, really interesting topic, as I find. And that topic is not only very interesting, but it's, of course, also very timely. And it has to do with this month. I mean, now it's only the 30th of April, but tomorrow we have May, and May is, of course, the months where we are going to celebrate the people are coming in, where we are going to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the creation of the state of Israel. And this story here has something to do with that, because you wouldn't believe it, but right after the war, right after, in 1945, you have a situation that in these 3 years, from 1945 until the creation of Israel, which is, of course, in 1948, you have over 200,000 Jewish people who live in Germany and who do that on a temporary basis, because they are all, of course, hoping to get out of Germany, to be in either go to America or to the newly established state of Israel. And the Allied victors, which were first and foremost the Americans and the British, they established about 500 so-called assembly centers. This is what they first called them, but then later on, they of course called them displaced persons camps. And this story about the displaced persons camps is not really a story that a lot of people know. And so that is why I'm very delighted that I can tell you this really amazing story. So we know, of course, that in there are people who are still wanting to come in. So we are, of course, talking about the liberation, right after the liberation of the concentration camps. We have Auschwitz being liberated in January of 1945 by the Russians. We have Buchenwald, we have Dachau being liberated in April by the Americans. And then we have a situation that right after, the end of the war, after May 8th, we have over 20 million people who were uprooted and displaced by the Nazis, who were then also expelled by the Russians, who were on the move. And it was really, they were traversing the European continent. And you would think that is a lot of people, 20 million. And these were, mostly these were people who were prisoners of war. They were former soldiers. They were forced laborers. So, for example, 20% of the entire workforce of Nazi Germany in 1945 was constituted by by forced laborers. You have survivors of death camps, survivors of work camps. They were all kind of looking, to get home to their home countries. And we're not only talking about Germany, we're talking about all kinds of people from all kinds of countries. And so astonishingly, between May and September of 1945, the Allied victors, they were managing to repatriate at least 6 million out of those 20 million people who were defined as displaced and who were eligible to return to their homelands. And then a big number of those 20 million were these 12 million ethnic Germans. And these were people who had been living in areas in like Silesia, Pomerania, Prussia, these areas that then at the Potsdam Conference, it was decided that these areas would from now on not belong to Germany anymore, but it would belong to Poland and to the Soviet Union. And so all of these Germans were expelled, and they then were also, going to the West. And 2 million of them died in the expulsion process, but most of them were then eventually integrated into that makeshift post-war society. So by January of 1946, you have about 1 million of the so-called unrepatriables that remained in Western territory. And some of them at this point in early 1946, you have about 20,000 Jewish people, but then in the course of 1946, you have about 150,000 and even more Eastern European Jews who were coming from the Soviet Union and from Poland. And in a very ironic twist of fate, many of these unrepatriables found temporary asylum in Germany, of all places, when you think of it, that they would go to the land of the perpetrator. And in order to help and support these people, the Allied forces, together with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, they were creating these aforementioned DP camps. And these DP camps, they were really they differed considerably in size and in configuration. They were housing anywhere between, let's say, 50 people, or the biggest one was housing 7,000 people. They were reappropriated schools, as you can see here, or they were sometimes even luxury hotels. Here we have one in the Bavarian Alps. Sometimes they were, if you take a look at this one here, they were primitive huts, but they could also be sturdily built apartment buildings, like you see here, this one on the bottom. And so here we see a list of, or like a map of the DP camps, and you can see that most of them were actually, could be found in the American zone. Let me just see. Yeah, here we have a better view of it. So everywhere where you see like a little dot there, basically, this is where these assembly centers, or nowadays, of course, we would call them DP camps, where they were. And this one is Föhrenwald. So this one is the biggest. That was of course, many of them were, of course, in Bavaria, but this one was about 20 miles away from Munich. And it was a settlement that had been built for workers for a huge German company. And this was happening in the late 1930s. And then it was designed at the time for about 3,000 people, but while it was used as a DP camp, it sometimes housed between 5,000 and 7,000 people. So you can imagine there was quite a bit of overcrowding going on. And in order to secure living space for the displaced persons, the Allies ordered many non-Jewish Germans to move out of their apartments. And that happened quite often when General Eisenhower was coming into town. So his arrival in cities and communities was often quite feared by the Germans, because it was known back then that when Eisenhower would arrive at the town in question, he would come with his with his entourage, and then he would look around and then he would point and he would say, okay, this one, and we take this one and this one. And so then usually the people in question had about 8 hours to vacate the premises. But before, usually what was happening was that the Americans were doing some research as to the ownership of these properties. And they made sure that they first and foremost were confiscating houses and farms of former Nazis. But then when more and more, especially in the course of 1946, when more and more DPs were arriving in Germany and when more and more assembly centers were needed, they became rather indiscriminate in their confiscation policies. An additional challenge, in addition to that overcrowding, was the fact that the displaced persons were brought to these places and then they were allocated according to their nationalities. And that was very problematic because in many cases, Jewish DPs had to live together with their former tormentors. For example, people who were from Lithuania or the Ukraine or Poland, who were collaborating with the Nazis. And they were living in the same camp, imagine. This man was quite a hero. His name is Koppel S. Pinson. Koppel S. Pinson was the Joint Director of Education and Culture for the Jewish DPs in Germany and in Austria. And he wrote a report. And in this report, he said, and let me quote him, he said, a large group of Poles, Ukrainians, Russians and Balts, who are not DPs in any real sense at all, were living in the camps, among them the bloodiest henchmen of the SS and the Gestapo. The Jewish leaders at the time, they were mostly the American military rabbis, together with the Joint. They were trying to convince the Americans and the British to please establish camps solely for Jewish DPs. But you also can imagine where the problem is, because the Americans were looking at this idea and were saying, absolutely not, because we are not Nazis. We're not going to re-traumatize the DPs by kind of singling them out, because that would perpetuate the racial policies of the Nazis. So yes, when you think of it, the Americans meant well, but on the other hand, that fact was prolonging their suffering because it wasn't a good idea to have these DPs living together according to their nationalities. And so the situation in the camps was quite chaotic. So here we have these two German historians, Angelika Königseder and Juliane Wetzel. They really are the ones, because it's very interesting. This topic has not been researched a lot. And these two women really have kind of spent a lot of their time as professional historians researching and dealing with this particular era in post-war German history. And so they wrote this book, and there they said, death had become a part of daily life. In many cases, the inmates of the camps had lost any sense of community, personal hygiene, or discipline. People who had to fight for every scrap of food, every piece of clothing, every inch of living space, even their lives, were incapable of changing their attitudes overnight. They had slowly to reaccustom themselves to the norms of civilized behavior. Many American and British soldiers who were employed to administer these camps, to make them secure, they were baffled by the behavior of the camp residents. When the two historians, when they were writing the book and when they were doing their research, they were able to interview a lot of these former American soldiers who had been there, in Germany. And so one of them told them that when they were really young, they were in their early 20s, and they were tasked with this job, of kind of working in a DP camp. This is what many of the soldiers thought. Why did they push and shove when food was being served, even though there was obviously enough of it to go around? Why did people still walk around the camps naked, even though they had been provided with clothes? Was it too demanding to ask that they use the sanitary facilities in the camps? Why didn't the residents of the camps work more to help improve the condition of their own surroundings? The tense situation became even more difficult when the frontline troops, so these were the ones who had helped liberating the camps, when they were rotated to go back to the United States, and then a new group of GIs was coming to Germany, and many of them fell, of course, into this kind of German Fräulein trap, one could even say, because while they were in America, they had these non-fraternization rules explained to them. But then, when they were then in Germany, as one GI said, we expected to see savages, but all we found were friendly old people and pretty girls. And he went on to say, the average soldier of our army cannot understand that the nice and clean-looking people with their well-kept homes and their sense of law and order could be dangerous or guilty of any crime. They strike most Americans in Germany as decent, pleasant, rather kind people who respect their parents, love children, and lavish affection on pets. So many young American soldiers were refused by this reversal because they were, of course, they were supposed to be very strict and authoritative with the Germans. And on the other hand, they were supposed to be caring and supportive with the DPs. But then, of course, these deeply traumatized survivors were disturbing in their behavior. And then another situation that was even making things even worse was Patton, General Patton, who was the commander of the Third Army. And the Third Army was in Bavaria, and most of the camps were in Bavaria. And Patton, I don't know if you know a lot about him, but he was a horrible anti-Semite. And so the whole situation wasn't good at all. But when we talk about history, of course, also is not only a conglomeration of events, but always also of remarkable human beings. And this man here, Rabbi Avraham Klausner, he was one of these amazing, remarkable human beings. So he was 30 years old in 1945, and he was a military chaplain, and he came to Dachau. Right after it was liberated. And so he had this really, really brilliant idea, among many other ideas that he had, and that was to create a list and a database of survivors in the liberated concentration camps. And so then later on, he added all the people in the DP camps. And then these lists were sent to other European countries, to the United States and to Palestine at that point. And so he really created an early tracing service. And because of that, relatives of survivors were informed that their family member was still alive, and then therefore families could be reunited. In addition to that, Rabbi Klausner was also, of course, witnessing these bad conditions in the camps. And so he took it upon himself to write a letter to this man that you, of course, are all familiar with, your President Truman, in late spring of 1945. And so Klausner wrote the letter, and Truman really also read it. And so he was also shocked. And so he reacted quite swiftly. On June 22nd, 1945, he asked this man right here, Earl Harrison, formerly the United States Commissioner of Immigration, and then he was the Dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So Truman asked Earl Harrison to please visit Germany, and here you see him with his team. And so he had to visit, or he was invited to please visit, about 30 camps in Germany and in Austria. And in order to make sure that Harrison and his team would get an authentic look at these camps, Rabbi Klausner met them in Bavaria, and he led them through these camps himself. Earl Harrison was appalled at what he saw there, and he wrote an angry report. Let me just read some of these sentences that he was writing. He said, The conditions in the camps were so bad that in late July, many survivors had no clothing other than their concentration camp garb, while others, to their chagrin, were obliged to wear German SS uniforms. It is questionable which clothing they hate more. In many camps, the 2,000 calories that were given to all DPs as a daily ration included 1,250 calories of a black, wet, and extremely unappetizing bread. And many of the buildings in which displaced persons are housed are clearly unfit for winter. And all these observations were culminating in the scathing bottom line of the Harrison report, and that is this one. We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people seeing this are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy. Imagine such a sentence, such a scathing, review of this, hitting, of course, Washington like a bombshell, you can imagine. So just a couple of days after receiving the Harrison report, President Truman wrote a letter to General Eisenhower, who held the job as the first governor of the American zone in occupied Germany. So he was very, very important. He was the most important person there. And so this is what Truman said. I know you will agree with me that we have a particular responsibility towards these victims of persecution and tyranny who are in our zone. We must make clear to the German people that we thoroughly abhor the Nazi policies of hatred and persecution. We have no better opportunity to demonstrate this than by the manner in which we ourselves actually treat the survivors remaining in Germany. General Eisenhower agreed, and promptly, finally, we have DP camps that were solely for Jewish survivors that were created. And in the course of the fall of 1945, General Patton was finally removed from his position, which was also helping quite a bit. And then plus the daily caloric rationing for, these 2,000 calories that was upped, that was increased to 2,500 calories. And Eisenhower closely supervised the implementation of these new rules. He even paid a visit to one of the bigger camps, Feldafing, which was also, of course, in Bavaria near Munich, for a Yom Kippur service in September of 1945. And then soon these new regulations took hold and they made a big difference. On November 5th of that same year, 1945, Eisenhower was happy to report back to the president, and this is what he says. Since Mr. Harrison's visit in July, many changes have taken place with respect to the condition of Jewish and other displaced persons. Except for temporarily crowded conditions, housing is on a reasonable basis. Nevertheless, efforts to improve their condition continue unabated. Subordinate commanders are under order to requisition German houses, grounds, and other facilities without hesitation for this purpose. Displaced persons have absolute preference over Germans for housing. Necessary guard should be done by displaced persons themselves on the volunteer system and without arms. I have recently raised the daily caloric food value per person for racial, religious, and political persecutees to a minimum of 2,500. Clothing and shoes are available in adequate amounts and of suitable types. So remember, this is November of 1945. And by the way, these disturbing findings of the Harrison report, because of that, in August, President Truman was asking these two people, who are, of course, the British leadership. We have Ernest Bevin and Clement Attlee. And so Truman asked them to please allow 100,000 DPs entry into Palestine. But if you know anything about this era in history, you know that they, of course, said, no, we are absolutely not doing that. So that, of course, was very disappointing. And then what was also disappointing was that Truman also had to fight a very unwilling Congress in his own country. And so then in December 22nd of 1945, he issued the so-called Truman Directive. So that was an executive order, and he said, enough already, I'm going to issue that. And that required that the existing immigration quotas be designated for displaced persons. So what that meant was that the overall immigration into the United States was not increasing, but more DPs were admitted than before. There were about 23,000. About 2/3 of them were Jewish, and they entered the United States between 1945 to 1947 under that Truman Directive. Help from the British would have been wonderful, but unfortunately, we weren't able to really get it. And that was even making the situation worse when in the summer, from the summer of 1946, when then more displaced persons came. So these were Jewish refugees who were coming from Poland, people who were coming from the Soviet Union, mostly because of that really terrible, tough anti-Semitism that was happening there. To just give you some very disturbing numbers, between November of 1944, so this is when the Germans were withdrawing, from Poland. So between November of 44 and October of 45, more than 350 Jews had been murdered in Poland by Polish people. And then between 1945 and 1947, 1,200 Holocaust survivors had been killed by the Polish. Imagine that they survived the Holocaust and then they're being killed. So now, of course, we have to kind of think about who were these DPs. There were basically like 3 subgroups. And so the first ones were concentration camp survivors who were between the ages of 18 and 45 mostly. So you might ask, well, why aren't there any children? Why aren't there any older people? Because of the horrible reality that children and old people were killed first. There were no children that were in this particular group. And there were no old people. There was this one woman who was in her 60s when she came into one of these DP camps, and people were looking at her as if she was an apparition. So she then became like the camp grandmother, because it was so unusual that you saw an older person, because of course these horrible Nazis had killed all of them. And then the second group, though, was the escapees from ghettos and transports who joined partisan units. Many of them, though, did have children. So these people had children, and they were also mentally and physically more fit than the former concentration camp inmates, because they had not had to endure the torment and humiliation to which these inmates in the concentration camps had been subjected to for so many years. And then the biggest group were the refugees from Eastern Europe. They were also called infiltrees, and they were mostly Orthodox Jews who were in better physical condition than the other 2 groups. And this is also the group with children. This is the group with people who are highly intellectual, who then would later on play an important part in the cultural, in the educational lives of these DP camps. And the fact that they had children, that really altered the age profile quite a bit. So right after the war, there were no children. But then in December of 1946, people who were like counting, the DPs, they made the astonishing discovery that already over 20% of all the DPs were like children now, so because of these groups who were bringing the children in. They had a name, the survivors called themselves the She'erit HaPleta. That is what this is. That is how you spell it, She'erit HaPleta, the spared remnant. And this term can be traced back to the book of Ezra, coming from the sentence, "O Lord, God of Israel, you are righteous. Now, as before, we are only a remnant that has survived." So remember when I said that in the beginning, you have these American soldiers who were baffled and sometimes shocked by that, by the behavior that they perceived as strange, weird when it comes to the survivors. The Harrison Report also took care of that a little bit, because in late 1945, the American government and representatives of the Joint, they created a job, and that job was advisor on Jewish affairs. And this was a person who was supposed to educate the soldiers. Also, of course, here you see the military media, first and foremost, Stars and Stripes, that had a lot of articles about, about the Holocaust survivors, the trauma of it all, PTSD, and so on. They also had a radio show called Army Talk, and so on. So that really helped quite a bit. Oh, and here we meet him again, Koppel S. Pinson. Koppel S. Pinson had such a great idea, because he was, as we know, he was responsible for the education in those DP camps. And he had a really great connection to one of the so-called monument men. And I'm sure that many of you are aware of these men who were so important in helping save, all these the important artworks and so on. And so one of these monument men told Koppel S. Pinson about the Rosenberg collection in a book depository in Offenbach. Offenbach is near Frankfurt. And this depository, here we have another photo of it, had over 300,000 books that had been confiscated by the Nazis from Jewish libraries, from archives, from bookstores. And Mr. Pinson managed to convince the Americans to please use 20,000 books from that Rosenberg collection and then give it to the DP camps. And that, of course, you can imagine, was really wonderful, because it immediately, kind of was providing these camps with libraries. And so when you think of it, many of these survivors, they had not had the chance to read a book, or go to a library or something. And so to have that in the camps was very important. Koppel S. Pinson was just one of many Americans who had made a difference. In many cases, maybe even your parents, your grandparents were the ones also, because there was so much, American Jews were imparting so much help, mostly donations. When you think of it, in 1945, the Joint spent $317,000 for these DP camps. 1 year later, the expenditures had increased tenfold to almost $4 million. And American Jews, as I just said, they were donating food, they were donating clothing and everything. They were also, another group that was very important, were the military rabbis, who were establishing or reestablishing a religious culture in the camps. So it's really quite interesting that when you think of it, in the American zone alone, which would have been southern Germany, the area, one could say, from Frankfurt down to Munich. So that area already had 87 rabbis working there in these DP camps. And religious organizations from the United States were helping out with delivering prayer books, sometimes even menorahs. So here we have a picture of the first Hanukkah celebration in December of 1945. Then here we have a picture of the first Pesach Seder in 1946. And then it took a little bit. So this only came in the late 1940s, but here we see a Talmud that was brought to Germany. And most of them, as you can see, when it comes to the rabbis, not the ones who came from America, but the ones who then were, of course, coming from, from Eastern Europe, they were mostly very Orthodox. And then one of the very important ones when it comes to the education aspect of it was Yehezkiel Yehuda Halberstam, who was the founder of a yeshiva in a very big camp in Berlin. And that was already attended by 150 men as early as February of 1946. And he was also the one who created a school for children, not children, for girls, actually, a Bet Jacob, a religious school only for girls, which was quite progressive for the time when you think of it. Here we have the main dining hall at the Landsberg camp. This is quite interesting because you have about 50% of the DPs who kept kosher, and then the other 50% who didn't. And that kind of gives us a little bit of a clue of the residents' religious intensity. These DP camps were really transformed into fully functioning Jewish communities. One of the problems, though, was that almost Babylonic, language chaos, because the people there didn't really have, many of them spoke Yiddish, but others didn't, And so that is why the camp directors were deciding what we are going to do is we're going to learn Ivrit and we're going to learn Hebrew, and everybody is going to learn it, the grown-ups and the children. And they also, of course, they had a reason for it, because they were thinking, well, sooner or later, we're going to go to Israel anyway. We're going to go to Palestine, then Palestine is going to become Israel, and then we're going to, of course, have this language skill. And as you can see here, she already has it. As she says here, the first snow is coming today. We demand shoes. When it comes to children and education, this was of utmost importance in the DP camps. To quote a sentence from the publication that was published in one of the camp newspapers. It was called Unser Leben. That means, of course, our life. The young people are our only surviving hope, and our future is dependent on their education. And so consequently, every child had to go to school until age 18. And then when they were 15, they had a two-tier system. So in the morning, they would go to school, and then in the afternoon, they were learning a profession. And this happened very early on. In November of 1945, you already have 27 teachers in that biggest camp there in Föhrenwald that were teaching 350 children in Hebrew, religion, English, math, drawing, sport, music. Children were not only encouraged to learn instruments, but also to participate in the camp choir or also in the children's orchestra. In the beginning, it wasn't so easy to find suitable teachers. Of course, all of this is happening while the Germans are very much pariahs. We don't even want to look at Germans, right? So we don't have any German teachers or anybody who is from Germany who is coming into these camps. And so that is, while at times it was a little difficult to find a biology teacher or something, or find, somebody else. And so that is why the pragmatism was prevailing. And so what happened was that they were then asking the camp doctor or the camp nurse, would you be able to teach a biology class? And so before then, you had like real teachers coming to the camps. You had people who knew a lot about biology because they were nurses and doctors. But so when it comes to children. You, of course, can imagine that they were revered in the camps because they were the most obvious identifiers of hope and of a future. And they were deeply loved by their parents because in many cases, they were really like the Herit Apleta. They were the last remnants, of a family that so many had lost. And so consequently, the camp administrations put a lot of effort into building a fun and forward-looking life for the children. In the summer, the ice cream man was coming into the camps and was handing out goodies. This is a picture from Leipheim, which is near Frankfurt, where they created an impromptu swimming pool by just putting water into a big basin. And then here we have little kindergartners who also enthusiastically were participating in celebrating various Jewish holidays. Speaking of holidays, it was very important to the camp residents to create and to celebrate their rich cultural life that not only was happening during holidays, but that went beyond, also dealing with Jewish traditions and so on. You have theater groups that were founded very early on. They performed works by Sholem Aleichem, also contemporary pieces that dealt with the horrors of life in the concentration camp, that dealt with the horror of the Holocaust. And this, of course, you can imagine, was quite a topic that was omnipresent for the survivors. And look at, this is rather unsettling, this picture, but this is from a Purim celebration in 1946. The Joint and the Board of Education supported the cultural life wholeheartedly by subsidizing drama groups. And also they had this great idea of sending mobile cinema units. And so that was actually, they had these big trucks, and then these trucks had projectors and big screens, and they would then drive to many of those camps. And so in October of 1946, the first movie that they showed was this one, Charlie Chaplin, The Gold Rush. And I can also tell you why, because at this point, they didn't really have a lot of, they had a lot of problems with the audio. So that is why they were thinking, let's just have a silent movie. And so then, of course, when it comes to like music and theater, all of our favorites, look, a very, very young Leonard Bernstein, he was coming also to the camps in 1949, actually. He was in Föhrenwald and in Feldafing, and he conducted an orchestra and did a couple of concerts. As the survivors were gaining strength and as they were settling into their new lives there in these DP camps, they were gradually also able to enter into relationships with each other. And so that is why you have a remarkable marriage boom to observe. And this was really quite incredible. We cannot underestimate that because, for example, when we talk about the biggest camp in the British zone, which was in Bergen-Belsen, which, of course, it doesn't sound great, when you think of it, that they actually took the Bergen-Belsen camp and then turned it into a displaced person camp. But from 1945 to 1947, they celebrated 1,000 weddings. And then especially, when usually what happens after a wedding boom, you have a baby boom. And that happened, of course, in the second half of 1946. Approximately 750 babies were born every month in the official US DP camps alone, in the US sector there in southern Germany. 750 babies per month. And while these children were a constant reminder of the future, the young parents, of course, were realizing, we need to learn trades, we need to learn professions in order to take care of our growing families, because one day, hopefully sooner than later, we're going to leave this terrible Germany and we're going to go to other places. And so this is where the ORT is coming in. The Organization for the Rehabilitation Through Training. And the goals of the ORT was, as the leader said in 1945, we must give the camp residents a purpose. We must reorganize their daily lives and introduce them to every possible kind and aspect of work, prevent them from letting their minds and senses atrophy and become even more demoralized. It is only through productive, creative work that we can lessen our anger at having lost so many years. And the survivors knew exactly what this ORT official meant, and they gratefully embraced these educational opportunities. It was really quite incredible. You had many thousands of people who were taking ORT courses. The ORT, they were employing over 620 teachers. You know, it was really quite amazing. There were 32 different vocational fields to choose from. The most popular ones were the traditional Jewish needle trades like tailoring, dressmaking, corsetry, but you also had auto mechanics, you had electricians, locksmiths, weavers, you also had, especially for women, you had cosmetology, bookkeeping, photography, carpentry, nursing, you had pharmacy. I mean, it was all kinds of things that you would be able to learn. Now, this is a great story because this happened to the sewing class. So what happened was that a woman, you know, who was in one of these sewing classes, she was looking around, and so she found silk, white silk. And this silk was not a lot. It was only enough for 6 wedding dresses. And she thought, what am I going to do with this? Because I know that there are thousands of girls, hundreds of girls who want to, have a wedding dress, but I only have the white silk for 6 wedding dresses. So the sewing class had this brilliant idea to actually make these dresses in 6 different sizes, from size 2 to size 12. And then they opened up a borrowing situation so that every bride was able to get one of these, was able to borrow one of these wedding dresses in their size. So that was really wonderful. Also, if people had a high school diploma and wanted to go on, and go on to higher learning, go to the university, they were also able to do that. So when the German universities were reopened, in Berlin, for example, you had over like 70 young DPs who went to the technical university as early as late 1945. So that was also definitely an option. When it comes to leisure, the most famous leisure activity was engaging in sports, most notably soccer. There was even a soccer league that consisted solely from teams from the various DP camps, and they would meet every weekend, and they would have their matches. They would be actually quite competitive. The track and field groups were also quite successful. So already in 1946, you already have 69 Jewish sports clubs that are in existence again. And not included, were, for example, here you see, look at them. Cheerleading, they had too. And then here we have the boxing teams. But what's interesting is that when these Jewish people came, from Russia, they were mostly interested. They were not really interested in boxing or in soccer. They were mostly interested in chess. So here we have a lot of, like chess tournaments, and this was all then happening when it mostly for in these camps, where a lot of these people from Russia were living. So now, of course, you will think, okay, so they have schools, they have food, they have, they are getting married, they have wedding dresses, they have soccer matches and everything. But the thing is that with all of that maybe normality in question marks, the overarching idea was always, we have to get out of Germany. We definitely have to get out of Germany. And sooner or later, we're going to do it. And we're going to do it. We're going to go to Palestine, and, then we are gone. And in order to, in order to kind of train for this eventuality that this is going to happen sooner or later, the Americans and the Joint decided that they were going to create training kibbutzim. Imagine you have kibbutzim on German soil. And this one was the biggest one. It was called Streicherhof, and it was named after this terrible man, Julius Streicher, who was the editor of the Sturmtrooper, the Stürmer newspaper. Here we see him actually at the Nuremberg trial. So he was convicted, sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trial. And so that's why, his state-of-the-art farm that he had there was requisitioned or repurposed into a kibbutz for young Jewish DPs. And this is where they learned the business of being a farmer and, everything that entails. And so here we have some interesting pictures. Usually it was not the only one. There were about 30 kibbutzim on German soil. When you think of it, how amazing, right? And so they were, mostly there were between 50 and 70 young people who were living in these kibbutzim, and then they were also, look, they have the dining room, and then here we have the Havarim. It was very, it was all very Zionist. They also at times had visitors from Zionist organizations who were giving the people lectures about Jewish politics and Jewish culture. There was one man by the name of Chaim Shapiro, who was one of the original DPs who learned the business of being a farmer here at that specific kibbutz that it was called, they were calling it Nili, but it was the Streicherhof. And he said, Israel is the homeland of all Jews, but the Streicherhof was our path to our homeland. The kibbutz in Nuremberg was the corridor that led to Israel. And look how interesting this is. Once arrived in Palestine, 20% of all DPs were assigned to work on farms and kibbutzim. But only 2% of them had agricultural knowledge. So you can see that those of them who actually were able to live and work in those farms or on those farms, they really had they had a leg up, basically. So that was very interesting, I thought. So then, of course, when can we finally go? You see April 1946. Which country would you like to immigrate to? There were a lot of people asked. 138,320 DPs were asked. And look what the answer is. 85% answered Palestine. Many of the DPs were enthusiastic Zionists. And then when this man that you all, of course, know, David Ben-Gurion, when he visited the camps, he was there twice, actually, in 1946 and in 1947. When he came there, he received an overwhelming reception. And look who we have here again, to our left, the picture is, there he is, Klausner. Rabbi Klausner with David Ben-Gurion. So then when finally 75 years ago, on May 14th, when this date came along and the state of Israel was proclaimed. Here, of course, we have the very world famous New York Times title page, Zionists proclaim new state of Israel, Truman recognizes it and hopes for peace, Tel Aviv is bombed, Egypt orders invasion. You have the situation when these people in these German DP camps, when they hear that, they are, of course, extremely excited. And they are immediately, getting ready, they're registering to immigrate to the Jewish state. And all in all, about 65,638 DPs from these DP camps immigrated to Israel immediately. They were leaving really fast. So, for example, in January of 1949, you have 64,269 Jews in 48 camps. By November of that same year, which really is only 10 months later, this number of almost 65,000 had shrunken to 15,000, and the 48 camps had shrunken to 9 camps. So they were going, and then the camps were usually closed. And of course, how would they do it? They would usually go, they would take a train to Italy, either France and then Italy, and then they would go to Genoa, and then from Genoa they would take a boat. Unfortunately, look how sad this is. Many of these DPs were going from the DP camps directly into the War of Independence. So 22,000 former DPs took part in the war. They were 1/3 of all the soldiers. So it was about 66,000 soldiers in total. And unfortunately, also 1/3 of all the casualties of the War of Independence. And then, of course, we know that you have this one group, that is going to Israel, but then you have this other group that says, no, we would like to go to America. And so you have the same thing happening in also 1948, June 25th, you have President Truman signing the Displaced Persons Act. And that then led to the fact that you have thousands who are making their way to Hamburg, who are making their way to Bremen, to Bremerhaven, to these big ports where they were boarding ships that would then bring them to America and to many of the relatives, who were, of course, awaiting them eagerly there. This is a photo from 1949, and that shows that there we are celebrating the 50,000th US-bound DP. But keep in mind that these were not all Jews, though. When we talk about the DPs, we're not only talking about Jewish DPs. So here we have a situation that then by the end of this, so 1952 is the year where then where basically most of them had left Germany, right? And so you have about 80,000 Jewish DPs who were moving to, or who had moved from 48 to 52, who had moved to the United States. So what happened to the DP camps in Germany? Well, I mean, most of them were closed down. The largest one, look at this, isn't that interesting? That's a map of Föhrenwald. And look, they already, in 1945, they already changed all the names to American states. Look, Florida Street, Ohio Street, Missouri Street. So Föhrenwald stayed open, though, until 1957. And you might think, why is that? Why was it open so very long? Well, 1957, there were still 750 inhabitants who, for whatever reason, decided not to go to America, not to go to Israel. Maybe they were too sick, or they were too old, or they had started a business in Germany, or they had fallen in love in Germany, or they just, they couldn't see themselves starting over, and so on. And so these people then, these remaining 750, inhabitants, they were then moving to other German areas. So the government gave them apartments, and then they were living a life in other areas there. But there was another reason why Föhrenwald stayed open as long as it did. And that had to do with these so-called retournees. And these were people who were realizing, going to the state of Israel wasn't as wonderful as they had thought. Of course, going to Israel in 1948 is not for the faint of heart, you can imagine. And so this is a fledgling nation. This is, you have harsh living conditions. People are living in tents. And so you have an estimated 3,500 people who are returning to Germany. But we have a problem with that because of this. So what happens is that when the DPs were arriving in Israel, they were immediately being greeted with an Israeli passport. That passport, though, said, this is valid everywhere, except for Germany, außer Deutschland. It said that until 1956, the passport said this is valid. This isn't valid in Germany because we don't want to have anything to do with these Nazis, So that's why they were, especially after the war, when you think of it, the Israelis, they were of course full of hatred when it comes to the Holocaust. Imagine. So that's why they were saying no German can travel to Israel and no Israeli can travel to Germany. So the fact that these DPs, who were of course now Israeli citizens, had this passport was a little bit of a problem. So that's why they had to, when they came to Germany, it was illegal. So they had to kind of think about where else could we go to. So that is why some of them went to South Africa, to Canada, Norway, of course, America, Brazil, Sweden, Uruguay, Australia. Even those two were extending an invitation, Juan and Evita Perón. So they gave visas to 29 families from Föhrenwald, enabling them to go to Argentina, which of course is always a little odd when you think of it, how many other people, that there were so many Nazis also going to Argentina. And then after the last DP left, the Americans handed the settlement over to the Germans again, and then an organization like a goodwill organization renovated all the houses and sold them to German families. And this is now what Föhrenwald looks nowadays. And so, ladies and gentlemen, ended a difficult and trying chapter in the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews who, during these crucial years from 1945 to 1948, came out of death and into life, and who overcame inconceivable adversity, but used the education and the skills and the relationships that they had developed in these DP camps in order to build rich and productive, and most of all, also meaningful lives in the countries of their choice. So I thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I'm going to look at the chat and see what kind of questions you have.
Well, thank you, Annette, for a wonderful presentation. And now the questions, please.
Yes. Okay, so, Faye Levinson said, I was born in Zeilsheim. And then, look, Marsha says, I was born in a US military base in Günzburg, Germany. And then Marty says, watching from Baltimore with our mother, who lived at the DP camp Kaserne in Ulm. Ah, yes. Esther says a very interesting book, Surviving the Americans, written by American officer observing the conditions in the DP camps. Ah, yes. Judith says, please repeat the number of survivors killed by the Poles. That was in the year right after the Holocaust, 1,200 survivors were killed by the Poles. And then we have about Morgan says we have about 10 minutes left. Yeah, so I think I was good in time. And then Ethel said, thank you for a fact-filled, thorough, interesting presentation. Paul says, I was born in Heidenheim. So many, isn't that interesting? So many of you were born. Well, yeah, I mean, 750 babies were born every month. Thank you so much. I didn't know anything about the DP camps. Yes. How were the Orthodox Jews from Eastern Europe able to survive with their children? Yes. So the thing is that, let me think. So many of these Eastern European Jews were spending the war in Russia, and they were spending it in places, you know, like Siberia or so. So they were, Stalin wasn't killing them, but they were, he was saying, okay, well, if you want to, you know, live here, then you have to go, first of all, to Siberia, and then you have to work. You know, they were in many cases kind of forced laborers, but they were not, they didn't have to go to a concentration camp. And so, oh, and then the other very interesting fact is, when it comes to the to nowadays, when we our Jewish community in Germany is Orthodox, so which is a big difference from, let's say, 100 years ago, when many of our German Jews were, of course, people who wanted to assimilate, and they were also more liberal, you know, a more liberal Judaism. And so the reason for that is that of this influx of these Eastern European Jews in Bavaria. So you have a situation where nowadays, like 90% or something of Jewish people in Bavaria are more Orthodox. But then if you have Jewish communities in, let's say, Cologne or Mainz, also very much in the west of Germany, this is where you have people who are more who are members of the Union of Progressive Jews, and and more conservative Jews. Very interesting. Yes. Okay. So then, what else do we have? Excellent, thank you. Oh, look, Gershon says he was born in Kazakhstan and lived in the DP camp in Rosenheim till 1949. So maybe, you know, if Gershon Weinman, if you wanted to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about this, I would find that very interesting.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So my father is from Poland and my mother is from Latvia, and they met in Kazakhstan. My father was in the Russian army after and after Stalingrad, he was thrown in the Gulag, and my mother from Latvia and her escaped to Kazakhstan. Anyway, we took almost a year to get to the American zone in Germany, and we lived in 3 DP camps. I remember 2 of them. The biggest one was Rosenheim, and it was a big apartment building. I think it was a German military barracks, I think, because I remember in the basement was a big shower room made for many people to bathe. And we were going to go to Israel, what supposedly our past on the underground boats was stolen. My mother had a brother in Detroit, and then we wound up coming to America. My father was very grateful to President Truman.
Yeah, and was that then in 48, or when did you come to America?
Came in August of 49.
Oh, 49.
On a military transport. There was a lot of soldiers on the ship. It was called the General Ballou. And And I remember in Rosenheim, we had a nice apartment. There was a stove, had plenty of food on the first floor. There was a little grocery store that was run by a Jewish man. His son Nachum was a friend of mine. They went to Israel. What else can I tell you? I mean, I don't remember that it was a bad time. I was a kid, so everything was
right.
just like you said, the kids were revered.
Beloved. Yeah, revered, right. Great, thank you so much for sharing this with us. Then there's a question. Sheldon says, what DP camps were in West Berlin? There was one big one in Schlachtensee. So that also had several thousand of people who lived there. Schlachtensee it was called. And then look, Davida says, here in the US, where Reform temples are closing, Shabbats and Orthodox Jewry seem to be growing. A large Chabad has opened in Prato Vallarta, Mexico. Oh. And then Vivka says, have you done any work about the camps in Austria? Much smaller in number, but also there. I was born in Graz. Took until 1948 until Canada started letting Jews into Canada. For those interested in this story, a book called None is Too Many by Irving Abella and Harold Trooper 40 years ago. Ah, yes, None is Too Many. I have to look at that. So that is also interesting when it comes to Austria, you know, and I wonder, Rivka, maybe you can unmute yourself and tell us why were your parents thinking about going to Canada? Was that easier than going to the United States, or had they set their sights on Canada?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you for this very interesting, informative talk. But you couldn't just decide where you wanted to go. Countries had to let you come.
Right.
You know, many of the Americans who came, many of the DPs who came to the United States had, not all, but had some kind of family connection. They had some way of connecting with people. So some of my parents' very close friends who went to the States went earlier because they had these connections, but we didn't have any connections. And it took a long time for Canada to decide that they were going to let in a few Jews. The None is Too Many comes from something that was said by a very nasty anti-Semitic Canadian immigration official, and not just immigration official, high up bureaucrat, who, when he was asked, and this is after the war when they already knew what had happened, when he was asked how many Jews should Canada let in, he said, "None is too many." Of course, an enormous amount of work was done here by the Jewish Labor Committee, by Canadian Jewish Congress, other groups, to make this change. And eventually Canada, the people that Canada let in, they let them in as workers. So you had to, and that was interesting in what you were talking about, because people had to be one of the groups of workers that Canada needed. An example, tailors, milliners, and hat makers, which is funny when you consider now hats are not a big deal, but they were a big deal then. Wow. And furriers. So people say furriers. Well, yeah, Canada had the furs, but Europe had the furriers, the stylists. And my father was a textile worker, which was not on the list. So how he transformed himself into a furrier is a story in itself. Wow. But that happened. And many people who were tailors or hat makers helped others become. You did whatever you had to do in order to help your friends and your chaverim to get to where they needed to go. Right. So but none is too many. For all the Americans who are watching this, if you want to really read a fascinating, brilliantly researched book, which was researched before internet, before anything, by two Canadian historians, I highly recommend it.
Oh, good. None is too many. Very good. And then, of course, the other thing that is also important to note is that those people who came to Israel in 1948, they also were placed by the Israeli government. It wasn't that you were saying, I'm now going to go to Tel Aviv. They were looking at what is your skill, where can we use you and your skill, and then if you were young and if you were fit to fight, you would immediately fight in that war and so on. Okay, so let's see. We have so many others. Okay. And then Judith says, my parents reunited in Feldafing. Oh, after my father survived the siege of Leningrad and helped to liberate Majdanek, he went to Modena to look for my mother. He described the survivors. Their boarding ships, the same as you described them. He went to the Vatican and asked them to send a postcard to Feldafing looking for my mother. He's saying, Herrliche Christen, Moshe Tellermann left. My mother heard that. My mother read that actually in Feldafing, and then later my mother arrived and found my father. That's right. So, but this is really wonderful. And maybe even
it said Moshe Tellerman lebt. He's alive.
Moshe Tellermann lebt. Yes. And, you know, maybe even Rabbi Klausner had maybe something to do with it. And maybe he wrote, you know, your mom's name on the list.
Mm-hmm.
How great. Okay. It's 3:15. Fran, would you like to kind of
Again, thank you for all coming. Annette, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. And we look forward to doing this again next year.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Have
Okay.
a wonderful rest of the
Bye-bye
day.
all.
Bye. Thank you very much.